Knowledge and information. This is the theme of this year's edition of Global Axess. The importance of knowledge has been evident to man since the beginning of time. But the information society presents new questions. How does the increasingly intense flow of information affect our ability to maintain a holistic understanding of the world? And does it actually make us smarter or dumber? Evolutionary biologist and Professor Mark Pagel believes that it is not the genius of man that lies behind history's greatest discoveries. Rather, it is our ability to trade information and draw conclusions from previous generations' experiences. He elaborates on his theory in a conversation with Mattias Hessérus.
When can we start to speak about information society?
I suppose that we can think of information as being stored when language and recording was invented. And that's probably sometime around the Sumerians, maybe 4,000 years ago or so. And at that point, things were being recorded, and they were being recorded in ways that didn't decay for long periods of time. And so, in some sense, we had information being collected. Prior to that, we didn't really have information written down in any way. It wasn't recorded in any way, but it would have been passed on orally by word of mouth. It would have been kept in people's heads before that.
And language seems to be key here. What do we know about how language has evolved?
Language probably evolved at the origin of our species. Our species is probably 160 to 200,000 years old. And so we've had language for that entire time. And the real question is, why did our species come up with language and no other species did? And it's probably tied up with knowledge. Our species was able to accumulate knowledge. We could make things. And those things that we made required skills, they required wisdom, they required techniques. And so we required a way of talking about those things, teaching other people to do those things. We also required a way of appraising them, valuing them, so we could trade objects between us. And so I think that language probably arose with our ability to accumulate knowledge.
Renaissance humanists, the Renaissance scholars, they tended to think about the human as somewhat special in that sense. And we had a desire to know, while other animals had other sort of talents, in a sense. But this thing, what is it coming from? Is that a great mystery?
It is a great mystery. And one of the things that we do know about humans is that we can recognize a good outcome when we see it. Now, this may come as a surprise, but if I show a chimpanzee two different tools, and one of them works well, and one of them doesn't work very well, the chimpanzee won't necessarily prefer the one that works well. It's as if they can't recognize a good outcome when they see it. But humans at some point acquired the cognitive capacity to recognize a good outcome when they see it. And as soon as they acquired that capability, you can see that they would then want to copy that outcome, copy that device that made that outcome. And you might say that that was the sort of birth of knowledge, the birth of the sort of information we would want to pass on with language to other people, to our offspring, and so on.
Well, let me stop you there, because it's almost a philosophical question here. Yeah. So what is a good outcome?
Yeah, well, a good outcome is something that we want that helps us achieve the currency of life, which is staying alive, staying fed, and producing offspring. And so if you look at the things that we make as people very, very early in our existence, those things are all related to hunting, fishing, gathering, shelters, clothing, all of these things that promote our life, our existence, and our reproductive success. And this is the sort of Darwinian currency of all animals.
And it seems like then, we talked about knowledge, but in order to have knowledge, we talked about language, but language in itself, of course, can't just produce or transmit knowledge. You need sort of a infrastructure as well. You have to put the words together and also maybe make a narrative. So what part plays stories in this, storytelling?
It's difficult to know. I mean, storytelling seems to exploit aspects of our brain. We call them mnemonics, things that help us remember. And it seems to be the case that if we put knowledge or information into a story, we can remember it better. We all know that we can remember the words to a song better if we remember the melody of the song, if we can sing the song. And so these things seem to be features of our brain that we have evolved, probably without knowing it, to exploit. And so we started storytelling because it worked. We didn't know that it was going to work, think, oh, let's put that into a story. We started storytelling, it worked, and so that probably caught on as a way of transmitting information.
And then you say we copy. So we copy from each other. Do we steal, or how would you describe it?
Well, one of the things I've described that we do is something I call visual theft. If I can see you doing something that's very, very valuable that I don't know how to do, I can steal it from you just by watching you. For example, if I see you making a fishing lure that I know is going to catch fish, I can steal that fishing lure from you, or at least how to make that fishing lure. And so visual theft set up a psychological conflict in human societies. And we probably needed language to help us resolve those conflicts. Because then I can come to you and say, I'll tell you what, if you teach me how to make your fishing lure, I'll teach you how to make a better pair of shoes, something I'm good at. And so there's another reason that language probably arose with our ability to recognize good outcomes, to recognize what was useful knowledge when we saw it.
What you describe is to be a very peaceful animal. It's just trying to copy each other, we try to recognize good outcomes. We tend to be adversaries as well. Not only always trying to help each other to further our aims. How do you explain that sort of?
Yes, this is the essential conflict in human societies, is that we show greater reciprocity, trading and exchange, give and take in human society than any other animal does. But at the same time, we are competing for our own self-interests. And so it's the conflict between my self-interest and my need to trade and exchange with you so that you don't think I'm stealing from you that defines human society. And we're constantly looking to cheat that little bit towards our own advantage. And that's a lot of the conflict of human society. And so we erect morality to help control cheating. We erect rules and laws and norms and expectations. And all of those things, again, are sort of transmitted by language as ways of controlling this conflict between reciprocity, which is something we do well, and my own self-interest.
But it seems to me when you describe this process that it just starts to go faster and faster. So for a long time, nothing really happens. Am I right there? Or is it a gradual sort of? We were talking about 4,000. We've been around a bit longer than that. So the Sumerians you spoke about and written language. So how come it takes so long before something really starts to accelerate?
Yes, you can look at humans as having been on a very, very long fuse. We have been around as a species for about 200,000 years. And at the beginning of our species, we had nothing more than very simple stone tools. Now, if you think about that, if a species has just very simple stone tools, we didn't have bows and arrows, we didn't have shelters, we didn't have clothing, just very, very simple stone tools, there's not a whole lot more you can do with that. There's one idea there, a stone tool. But now imagine what happens when you've got a stone tool and I have a club, a wooden club. Somebody looking at those might think, ooh, what if I put those two things together? I could make an axe with a handle on it, a hafted axe. And so you can see in this way that as ideas collect, we can combine them in increasing numbers of ways. And so as ideas accumulate, there are more and more and more ways to combine them to make more and more and more things. And so we expect the pace of technological change to increase with time. And that's exactly what we've seen.
So your argument here is basically there's no single individual who came up with a stone axe. It wasn't someone who sat down and said, well, I could probably do this. I have this stone, I have this piece of wood, I combine them, and look what I've made.
That's right. We are very, very good at trial and error, playing around with things, bumbling along, giving things a try, without really thinking about where we're going. So you're right, it's probably not the case that somebody sat down one day and said, I think I need a hafted axe, an axe with a handle on it. It could have been the case, though, couldn't it? It could have been.
We don't know.
We don't know. It could have been. Yeah, it could have been. But it's probably more likely that somebody happened to see a piece of wood lying across a stone and just thought, oh my goodness, that could make a very nice axe. And then somebody else probably thought about wrapping a bit of material around it, plant material around it, to hold it to it, and all of a sudden you had the birth of this axe.
If you were to say top 5 technological inventions that sort of changed the course of civilization and the way we developed, what would that be?
Goodness, it's very, very difficult, but very, very early in our history, what sort of lifted us out of being just another upright ape was that we refined the hand axe. So we had these hand axes that our predecessors had made, species that came before us, but we refined it. Another thing we did was to make spears with very sharp tips on them, so those spears could be thrown at prey rather than us having to run up to prey and jab them. That's very dangerous. Another thing that we came up with early in our existence, and this will seem like a small thing, but was the sewing needle. We came up with a way of shaping bone so that we could put a bit of plant material in it and sew clothing. So we were the first species ever to have clothing. Neanderthals, for example, probably didn't have clothing. So things like the bow and arrow, the spear, the hafted axe, the better hand axe, and the sewing awl or needle are probably really top 5. And that just really set us on a course of being able to exploit our environment better than any other species and to stay alive while we were doing it.
Also, biologically, because of this, do we also tend to evolve? I mean, evolution tends to take some time. It's not really overnight, is it? But would you say that our inventions and the copying itself also have direct biological implications? Our
inventions have turned around and shaped our bodies. There's absolutely no question about it. If you compare us to the Neanderthals. Now, the Neanderthals, of course, are our sister species that only went extinct maybe 25,000 years ago. They're identical to us in over 99.9% of our DNA. And we still have some DNA from the Neanderthals as well, we know now. There's some evidence that we might have interbred with them. We carry some of their DNA. And yet, they were physically very, very different from us. They were stocky, muscular. They had heads that were larger than ours, and all of those seemed to be adaptations for close combat, for clubbing each other, for killing their prey at close combat, whereas we were the first species that, you can in some sense say, transferred our physicality to our weapons. So we made these spears that we could throw, or we made a bow and arrow so we could shoot the arrow. And so we are much more what's called gracile. We're lighter weight, less muscular than those species. And so very early in our evolution, our inventions were turning around and sculpting us. And they still are. What is the time frame we normally talk about when it comes to evolutionary changes? I mean, it is always this idea in sort of science fiction that people of the future will have very big brains, or and tiny, tiny bodies. There's always this idea that we become less and less muscular. And of course, nowadays many people go to the gym and they are very fit in a way that people might have been in other ways before, but not in this very sculpted way. Yes. Normally, how long does it take? Yes. Well, it's very difficult to put numbers on those, but I can give you a couple of examples. Yeah. So sometime around 8,000 BC, humans somehow evolved a gene that allowed them to break down milk. So we evolved an enzyme that allowed us to digest milk. So we became lactose tolerant. We can drink milk as adults. That gene swept through European populations such that nearly all Europeans acquired it within about 4,000 years. So over what is a very, very short period of time in the history of the world, and even in the history of our species is about 200,000 years old. Within about 4,000 years, most Europeans had acquired that gene. Another example is that up until around 8,000 years ago, no one had blue eyes. Blue eyes evolved about 8,000 years ago. And that gene has swept to very high frequencies in parts of Northern Europe. And so we know that over a few thousand years, there can be real changes to human populations.
But it also means that when you introduce a technology, you might not be biologically or prepared also when it comes to cognition. So, for example, we look at our information technology today, which is fast. People claim it to be addictive, or it is addictive in many ways. How can we look at that through evolutionary eyes and from the point of view of evolutionary biology?
Yes, I mean, you can say that many of the things that we used to be good at, running around, hunting, fishing, chasing prey, we no longer need to be good at. So the physicality is no longer important. And that we've changed society in such a way that what matters now really is cognition and temperament. And so what you're referring to with people being addicted to the digital age is that we've created these digital machines that, a little bit like storytelling, a little bit like songs, these machines exploit parts of our brain that we are weak to. So, for example, social media exploits the part of our brain that says we want to be liked by people. And this isn't lost on Facebook. You know, Facebook knows that being liked is addictive. And so, in many ways, what we're seeing for the contemporary era and into the future is that people who have the temperament to be able to deal with the information age, who have the temperament to be able to sit at a desk all day, who are perhaps less violent in their outlook or less aggressive in their outlook because we are living in larger and larger and larger social groups, and we tend to throw people in jail who misbehave. So we're selecting very positively at the moment for a whole different set of behaviors and temperaments than we've had in the past. And this new set of behaviors we're selecting for, we're not necessarily very good at. We have a long way to go.
4,000 years, apparently.
Yes, that's right.
But what answers can evolutionary biology give us when it comes to these kind of problems? I mean, in a sense, 4,000 years, that's just disencouraging. But is there other things we can sort of learn from the process of how we came to this point? And what are the positive effects of this? And in what way can we use it?
Well, I think the positive things are that in large populations, there's always going to be a great deal of genetic variability. And evolution tells us that when that genetic variability exists, evolution can latch onto it quickly. And so as society changes, we're always going to have some people who have the right set of characteristics who are going to lead us into the future. And so even though we're always playing catch-up, even though we're always 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years behind, we're always going to be able to generate that diversity of genetic material that means that evolution will be able to drag us along.
Let's go back to connectedness and the development of knowledge through sharing of information. And we seem to be in an age where we share a lot of information with each other. You're critical of the idea of this sort of, one bright thought that changes everything.
Yeah.
Can you give me a few examples of that? Can you give me the argument why that is not the case?
Well, when we look at the people who we revere as the great inventors, it turns out that when we delve into what they do, their achievements are less about a flash of inspiration or a flash of insight than they are about bumbling along by trial and error and eventually copying others. And so, for example, Thomas Edison, we often credit with inventing the light bulb, and yet his own diaries show that he tried 6,000 different materials before he just chanced upon the right one for a light bulb filament. And so that was just really trial and error. It wasn't a flash of inspiration that he came up with to say, that's going to be my light bulb. When we look at James Watt, whom we often attribute the invention of the steam engine to, we see that he improved upon a previous design by John Newcomb. Henry Ford, we attribute the assembly line to. He improved upon existing assembly lines. And Steve Jobs, very interestingly, we give him a lot of credit for the point-and-click operating systems that the Apple computers use. And yet the Xerox Corporation claims that he perhaps even stole that idea from them when he was touring their factory. And we have to bear in mind that even the sort of genius of Isaac Newton, he very famously said, "I stand on the shoulders of giants."
Does this mean then that there's just infinite progression? I mean, in a way, the way you explain it is that, so we have all this interconnection now. We're able to share information at a speed and at a level we've never seen before. So will this mean that we're going to, find ourselves in Shangri-La or Utopia a couple of years from now?
Well, yes, let's hope so. I mean, the world is connected in a way it's never been connected before. Things like Facebook means we can transmit our ideas around the world, telephones, Skype, these kinds of things. Airlines take us around the world so we can actually take our ideas and people and goods and services and so on. And scientists are collaborating around the world in ways they never have. And so this connectedness means there's a flow of ideas and thoughts and actual objects. And we expect that the simple combinatorics, all the different ways that one can play with those things to come up with new objects, will mean there will literally be an explosion of sort of knowledge and technology. And I think that all we have to do is ask our parents' generation what it was like, and they say, well, our lives were pretty much the same for 20 or 30 or 40 years. But when we get to our lives and our children's lives, we see they're changing over a period of 5 to 10 years. And so we can name technologies now that we're all using around the world that didn't even exist 10 years ago. Things like self-driving cars, things like the Amazon Echo devices, things like the iPhone, things like virtual reality, didn't even exist 10 years ago, and now they're almost, universal. Everybody's got access to them. So we are going to continue this pace of change at a sort of dizzying rate, I think.
But you're speaking about trial and error, but the only thing we've been talking about is trial and success. Where's the error?
Yes. So what we are good at is playing around with things and trying combinations, and when we find something that works, we can all copy it. So you and I might engage in trial and error until we achieve a success, like Edison did with his light bulb, but then everyone can instantly copy that. And what the connectivity around the world means is that something might be invented in New Zealand and it can be copied in Alaska, practically all the way around the world within a few milliseconds, simply because we're so connected now. And I think that's why information and knowledge and technology are changing so rapidly.
But isn't one of the key concepts here what works? And what works, when you discuss, is basically, will it catch on? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's any good in it, really. And if you look at information technology, and also when we're talking about cognition, who we are as human beings, we're sort of designed to go out and hunt and use information in certain ways, and then suddenly we have a different kind of technology that we're not really made for yet. Maybe 4,000 years from now. Can you explain the downside?
Yes, I mean, we see the downsides all around us. So that one of the things that you would predict is that an animal like us, who comes from a hunter-gatherer background, not that far long ago in our past, being able to rest whenever you can would be a highly desirable thing. We like to be sedentary. We like to sit down and rest. And there's good reason for that. We shouldn't waste energy. But now that we live in a society in which energy, foodstuffs, is an absolute surfeit, there's an excess of these things, we all tend to put on weight. Another thing is that we like problem solving. And again, you should expect this of a species that has to go out and make a living every day in the form of hunting and gathering. We like problem solving. So these computer games that we play allow our brains to engage in problem solving. It shouldn't surprise us that they're addictive. And so in many, many ways, we are creating technologies that play to our weaknesses, and that's why we take them up. Things that exploit weaknesses in us, and they're the ones that we're most likely to engage in.
So isn't this then one of the the problems we just, I suppose, have to live with. That we look for short-term gain rather than long-term. It's either, you want that sugar because we know that it gives us energy, but it's if you get sugar every day and a lot of it,
that's right,
it's not particularly good for you.
Yeah.
So we're hardwired for this sort of short-term gain because we designed to live in an environment which is very hostile to us. So what happens then? Can we find ourselves in a situation where we're actually not, that progress will stop? That's really what I'm sort of getting at. That you have a tipping point of technology.
Well, what I see might become a sort of tipping point is the realization that we have created a species whose technology is causing it to spiral down a drain of poorer and poorer and poorer health. And I think many of us are realizing that now, that many of the diseases of old age, like diabetes and heart disease, Alzheimer's, dementias and so on, that many of these things are associated with lifestyle. And we are playing catch-up with that. We're realizing that now, even though it's probably been true of us for 50, 60, 70 years. And so the tipping point is going to be when we rein in on our use of these technologies, or we rein in on our use of this excess resources we have access to, like foods, that will slow us down a little bit. But I don't think it's going to be a tipping point in our development of technology. We'll continue to run off in other directions. I mean, at the moment, sort of medical and genetic technology is really going to be the talking point of the next century, I think.
So it's basically we do a trial and error, but with really large samples nowadays, and in short periods of time as well, compared to the sort of before settlements in that sense. With a very, very long period of time we're looking at. Do you think technology will fix the problems that technology creates?
Yes, I mean, when technology creates problems, it creates a marketplace to fix those problems. And the real drivers of technology at the moment is profit, is making money. And so I don't want to be a Pollyanna about it and think that life is just going to get far, far better. But what we have is a way of tackling problems that we've never had in the past. And so I'm speaking of, for example, genetic engineering, stem cell work that will allow us effectively to rebuild our bodies. We're not that far off, probably in the lifetime of our children, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're not that far off being able to regrow body parts. And so if we have a damaged or worn out body part, perhaps we'll just regrow it rather than trying to train the person to eat less sugar, eat less meat, and go out for a run every day. And so I think there will be technological solutions, and they're going to be highly profitable, and those things will catch on.
How do you, as evolutionary biologists, look upon those changes? Basically, you're trained to understand how evolution works, and then suddenly we'll go in and we'll just change it completely overnight. What are the implications of that?
Well, I mean, I think what's happened is that we've just shifted one information stream. We used to evolve along the information stream of genetics. We're now evolving along the information stream of knowledge, that we replicate that knowledge and pass it down the generations. And so we've, in some sense, shifted the balance in favor of culture and knowledge, and genes are becoming less and less relevant. And so we're in a sort of dangerous phase where our genetic backdrop, our genetic makeup might be less and less important as we acquire the ability to sort of rewire ourselves within our lifetimes. And we're just going to take off into this new realm of knowledge and technology. It's going to be a different world 100, 200 years from now.
And evolutionary biologists will be a completely different breed as well, I suppose.
Evolutionary biologists will become cultural evolutionists, knowledge evolutionists, rather than genetic evolutionists.
Mark, my Fitbit is telling me and us that we need to stand up and walk around. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mattias.